Hello, my name is Irina Goch and welcome to the International Business Conversations. Today, my guest is co-founder of Tesla, Marc Tarpenning. Marc, hello, how are you?
Hello, it's great to see you.
Can you please introduce yourself and tell me a bit more about what you do at the moment?
So at the moment, I'm a venture capitalist. I'm a venture partner at Spero Ventures, which is an early stage fund here in Silicon Valley. But before that, I was an entrepreneur several times, most famously with Tesla Motors. I'm the co-founder of Tesla Motors, as you said. And before that, I mainly was a programmer. I happened to, be deep into the computer stuff. So since I was, a teenager.
You co-founded Tesla, one of the most famous startups that actually challenged the status quo of the car industry. What are the most significant takeaways that you can share with me today from the early days of Tesla?
Well, some of it is from the current days of Tesla, actually. So from the early days, uh, these big entrenched industries are pretty ripe for change if you have some idea that makes sense. They have certain advantages. They have scale, they have capital, and they move really, really slowly. And this, for a startup, is your big advantage in that you don't have to move so slowly. And just give you a little example, when we were developing the Roadster, which was our first product, which was, we started the company in 2003. We were hoping to get the Roadster out, I think in 2006, which was more like 2008. But anyway, that's a startup, in all ways. But we would have these board meetings, and Elon was on the board at the time. He was an investor. That's how we know him. And the board would be very concerned with, once we came out and people saw what electric could do, we figured there was, the big guys, the Daimlers and Volkswagens and Fords and GMs would come after us. And, they had infinite resources. And the question is like, from the time we got the Roadster out to the time we could do a sedan, and there's lots of reasons to start at a sports car and go to a sedan. We can talk about that later. But that's going to be several years, and they have all those resources to catch up. And, could we get there in time? Could we get the sedan out in time before they crushed us, basically? In that whole time, we never had any discussions about a timeline where we release the Roadster becomes a success, we go public, it takes us several years longer than we thought to get the sedan out, we release the sedan sells super well, and the sedan, it starts being shipped all over the world. And only after the Model S becomes the top selling luxury sedan in Germany does the first of the big companies wake up and go, oh shoot, there's something here. That like 12-year gap, we never guessed the big incumbents would take, which allowed us to get successful, really. That is something that is, when you talk about the big companies just don't move very quickly. I mean, this was just a classic example of that. And that's something that's really powerful. These big incumbent industries just move really slowly, despite what they say. They've got these giant ships. So that's my big takeaway, is that you really can disrupt these big industries, and their ability to respond is super slow.
Thank you. I think that is very interesting and certainly will be something to think about for students when we study different cases of big companies and startups. Another question that I have is about your idea of reducing the reliance on oil. You said in one of your talks that reducing the reliance on oil was your drive to reinvent the car.
Mm-hmm.
Was it easy to find investors back then?
No, it was terribly hard. We were pretty good at fundraising. Well, we thought we were pretty good at fundraising because we had done it before successfully with our first company. And so we thought, well, we know what we're doing. And we went to raise money. And, this was in 2003. global warming wasn't really on the people's radar nearly as much. There had been some um, spectacular failures of companies. There always are in Silicon Valley. So we went along and we were able to secure some money from a couple of VC funds, small VC funds, and the usual suspects of angels and stuff. Um, but we needed a lead investor, and we hadn't. We were working on that, and we would have gotten it. I mean, we had a couple of firms doing due diligence, which is the next step of. So we were somewhat confident, but it was really hard. You get turned down all the time, no matter what. There are some startups that seem to be really hot, and they talk about, oh, all these VCs are calling. We've never had that happen in anything that we've done. We're always just struggling for money, and and in fact, that's how we met Elon. Is we pitched him, and he was a super angel, and he said, "Oh, I love this idea. It's totally aligned with my belief of changing the energy equation." So he led the round, and once he led the round, then everything catalyzed around it. And but it was a struggle. We actually didn't take that long. In retrospect, it was only we started fundraising the first week of January, and we were closed by April, which is actually pretty decent. But every funding round always had, some drama and trying to get investors in. I mean, it just raising money is hard, and I'm sure that there are companies that it isn't hard, but every company I've been associated with, which is probably saying something, raising money is difficult.
I think that it's also important, reflecting what you've said again in one of your interviews, that you also need those money before you need to raise those money before you actually need them. Uh,
Oh yes, yeah. You
that
don't. You cannot run out of money. That's a very very bad thing.
How did you feel when Tesla Roadster was sent into space? Do you remember your thoughts at that moment?
Oh, I thought it was great. It was so absurd. Elon has quite a sense of humor. It's a very geeky sense of humor, but it's a good sense of humor. And when I heard, and there is this, when you launch these first rockets, you do a dummy payload. I mean, and normally it's cement bags is what they use, and there was no way he was going to do cement bags. But to put a Roadster in it, I just thought was totally brilliant. It was so funny, and it shows me the power of of keeping your mind very open to the future. Because I've said this in a couple of my talks. If you had told me that some car that I worked on was going to get blasted into orbit, and then from there blasted into a heliocentric orbit, and now is for the next million years is going to be going around the sun and then out to the asteroid belt and back. I mean, like, that's so insane. And yet, that's exactly what happened. I can go and see it. Like, it's craziness.
It's unbelievable. And
Yeah,
when
yeah.
I was thinking about this question, when I actually said it out loud, it's like a miracle.
It's so bizarre. Yeah.
In one of your interviews, you were talking about technology, and that you said that in technology, something does not seem possible until someone else shows that to you. And then you go, oh, I could have actually done it myself. Why do you think this is so prevalent in technology? And do you think that it applies to other areas of life?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I came across uh, this observation long ago with somebody growing crystalline structures in labs in a lab. So and he commented that, uh, and I don't exactly remember the context anymore, but these crystalline structures are super hard to grow. And there's of different chemical compositions, and there's a whole. They were looking for novel properties of these crystals, and there's lots of labs around the world that have worked for decades on certain chemical compositions to get these perfect crystals to form. And he said it's the craziest thing is that we're all working away, and then someone will get it to work. And the moment that they announce it, and it's typically way before they publish the paper. The rumor gets out, and then it sort of comes out. He says within a month or two, like 7 labs around the world can grow the crystals using slightly different techniques, but they spent 10 years trying to get there. There is definitely something psychological that once it really can be done, in that it just it really focuses you on, okay, well, now we know it's possible. Like, what didn't we see before? And that's definitely the case. Electric drive, it in itself wasn't particularly complicated, but getting it to be high performance, getting it to work well, getting the energy density of the batteries where we needed it. Now, we didn't develop the cells, but getting that combination of cells and getting the structures and being able to manufacture that. When we did that, in retrospect, it seems really simple. And it also, in retrospect, it seems like electric cars are obvious because they have, super high efficiency, super high performance, and yeah, I mean, like, really, really much more efficient than anything else that's possible, or at least anything else that we know of yet. And but at the time when we were raising money, for example, we had to create all these white papers showing that our analysis was correct and that this really did make sense. And then once it kind of comes out, then everyone goes, "Oh, of course." And I think that lots of innovation is like that. When the iPhone came out and, Jobs is up there on stage and he says, "This will change everything." He had no idea that it was going to change everything, but he's a great salesperson, or was. But once that came out, then everyone, and at first it was like, why would anyone want a smartphone? Why would anyone want all of that intelligence? And then, a week later, it's like, oh my gosh, of course, it's the most obvious thing. And it's not even patentable because it's so obvious, but it wasn't obvious until the iPhone came out. So I think that there is something strange with humans and psychology. And once it's possible, it becomes much easier.
I know that you like to explore history, and I know that you also go and study on Coursera. That's what you've said in some of your talks.
Oh, yeah.
I know that you like to explore events that are seemingly unconnectable. Can you please share something that you've learned that you think is quite significant?
Yeah, I mean, so like right now I'm taking yet another Roman history class. I've taken, several different ones. This one happens to be through the Stanford Continuing Education, but Coursera is one of my favorite sources. And you know, the similarity between the sort of political machinations and the pressures that caused the fall of the Roman Republic, and what's going on in the U.S. in this last few years, and still going on, is so creepily, shockingly the same that it, and of course it ended, badly. Well, the Republic fell, but then of course the empire, the imperial period started, the Principate. But so I guess you could say that wasn't so bad for the next 400 years. But it really, there's some famous person said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does tend to rhyme. So I do I do find that we think about all our problems as sort of unique, and actually global warming might actually be kind of unique, but actually, our ancestors, had all these things happen to them. In fact, I was listening to a presentation by, I think it was the CEO of Hilton. It was one of the hotel chains, and I can't remember exactly which one, but I think it was Hilton. And he said that this is when the pandemic was really shutting everything down, and the company was reeling, and and it was a thing to his employees, and he said, we're going to do everything we can to survive this and keep everybody, employed. Um, but it helps that our company is 150 years old. So I went back and looked at the CEO notes of the last pandemic in 1918 and how they went through that, and then World War One and World War Two, and then the span, and it was just a nice reminder that our ancestors were smart and did things and survived them. In terms of technology, directly, one of the things I'm interested is agriculture, for example. And something that people forget is that everything that we do, everything that we eat, the whole world that we inhabit is man-made. And that's, from the foods we eat to obviously the structures we live in, and the roads, but even the trees that we see when we walk around are typically planted and cultivated, and they're not, a lot of times they're not even native. I get pushback from people, and I wrote a blog post about this where, they say, I only eat natural food. I don't want any of that genetically engineered stuff. I don't want any of this, weirdly, farm stuff. I only eat natural food. And I always ask them, like, well, what do you eat then? And because, like kale and broccoli and um, cauliflower, we made those. And we know when we made them. And we don't know exactly the person who made them, but we know the region that they came from. We know that the farmers that invented broccoli, in the first, during the Republic period of Rome, they actually had a really great business because people liked broccoli. But they made it, they created it. It wasn't natural. It was something that they made. Wheat is that way. Of course, how we created wheat is lost, and but we know we made it. Corn, corn's totally created by our ancestors here in the New World. So I like to keep thinking that the future is made. It isn't. We created it. Progress is not inevitable. We the when Rome fell, and you can debate some of the nuances of this, but uh, progress largely, well, certainly like running water and sanitation in Italy, in Rome, stopped in 470, two or whatever, and didn't have running water again until the middle of the Renaissance. It was 1,000 years where we didn't have running water and sewage, and sewers. And you think about that, and it's hard to imagine our current pace of innovation, like, oh, that just can't be. But it can be, because we make the future happen. We literally create it. So that's something in history I like to come back to. Is like, wow, we had these advanced machines, mechanical machines in the Greek period, and we forgot how to do that. And it took us until the 18th century to remember, or to rediscover that. Cement. The Romans had figured out cement and paved the known world, and then we forgot how to make it. And the Renaissance people looked back at the liquid stone that the ancients used in wonder. So we don't want to have that happen again.
That's why we need to work on sustainable development.
Absolutely.
You have been both the inventor, the founder inventor, and the now you are an investor. What is the most valuable lesson that you've learned from both of the roles?
Well, at the moment, I'm so focused on seeing companies, come in. On a really practical level, you want to always, have a solution to a problem that exists. And I know this sounds funny, but we still see many people who have really developed beautiful technology and are looking for a problem. Those are, solutions looking for problems. And that tends to not be successful. As an entrepreneur, we always looked, Martin and I, had co-founded Nuva Media before, and Tesla. We always really did focus on, the core problem, always remembering what the problem was, and the customer, keeping the customer centered. I mean, these are very basic, entrepreneur things, but it's funny how, uh, you know, on a weekly basis, I see companies where I go, they didn't get that right. They don't seem to be focused on the product, or they don't seem to be focused on the customer. It's really about their tech, or their particular, philosophy or thing that they're doing, and it's not clear that anybody cares. So always making sure that you have that customer focus, that market need, and customers don't know what they need. I mean, you have to, you can't do a survey and figure out what that new product is going to be successful, because frequently customers can't imagine the product you're going to bring them. But keeping it in mind, showing them what's possible and saying, and making sure that it fits their needs is really key. The other thing that I've learned is that, on the other, being on the check writing side, it's super hard to figure out, when to write a check. We would always go and present to a VC, and when the VC would say no or wasn't sure, we'd always go like, how can they not get it? Like, it's clear that we have the best thing. Like, how can it not get it? Well, now being on that side of the table, it's super hard. Like, there's lots of viable companies. You're trying to figure out which one is the most viable, that has the best future, that you can help the most. Because even if you think some other company might be, in a sense, somehow potentially more successful, if it's not in, if you don't think you can help them, then that whole success is less. And so it's a very complicated thing. And it is certainly, if I ever have to be on the entrepreneur side raising money again, I will do it better because I have a lot more sympathy for the people writing the checks.
Do you think that the success of Silicon Valley can be replicated? And yes, no, and in case if yes or no, why? And what governments, investors, and inventors should do in order to make it happen?
Well, this has been a huge question for a long time in Silicon Valley. And uh, it's, Silicon Valley works because there's an ecosystem that supports it. Now, things may have changed. I mean, in the sense that the pandemic might redistribute Silicon Valley around the planet a little bit more equitably, which would be great. It certainly has changed the formation of companies and where people live. Uh, One thing that's a misunderstanding of Silicon Valley frequently is that it's because there's a university here, and that university is what makes it all happen. Or several universities, Berkeley and Stanford are the pillars on both sides, but there's other ones around too. That's not sufficient. And it's, oh, there's VCs here, and that's actually very useful, but it's also not sufficient. There is a culture here that makes it work. And I'll give you an example in that when we started all of our companies, you think about the new idea and you get excited about it and you decide to make it happen. And very quickly you can file some paperwork to get the legal entity to exist. So that's one thing, but that's anywhere in the U.S. you can do that. In many countries, it's also quite easy. So that's sort of needed, but that's simple. And that's not the case in other countries, especially in Europe, where that company formation can be very, very complicated and very difficult. So that's a barrier the government can fix. But that's not enough, because it's the mindset of the people around you. So you then go and you start talking to people who have good jobs, who have jobs at Facebook and Google and Apple and everything, and you tell them this crazy idea and you say, hey, we don't have any money, but we want you to quit your job and give up all those perks and the dry cleaning and the gourmet chef for lunch and everything, and come and we don't and work for us, and we're like operating out of a Starbucks right now. And the thing that's crazy about Silicon Valley is you have a lot of people that go, oh yeah, okay, I'll do that. That freedom, that expectation to do that is a really big deal in terms of getting talent into your company. We also then, go to even to create the company, we went to the law firms and said, we need you to write the paperwork and everything. And oh, and by the way, we don't really have any money. And they'll be like, okay, we can do that. But you have to give us shares in the company in order to do that. And then, that's a decision that you as an entrepreneur make, whether you want to allow the law firm to have any part of your company or not. But you can do things for free because you can give away a little of the company's shares. Also not something that works in most places. When we went to rent our first offices, literally the entire negotiation, I happened to have this negotiation in the same week. So I have this great contrast. We were trying to open up an office in Detroit. to help with some supplier issues that in Detroit during the Tesla time. And we were renting a building which had been empty. It's a small building. We just needed a few offices that had been empty for over a year. They had not been able to rent. It was in a nice part of Detroit, but it's still not a great real estate market, particularly at the time. We had spent months trying to get the contract signed. They wanted they wanted to know what our public ticker symbol was, and we didn't. We weren't public. We were a startup. They wanted 7 years of financial return, tax and financial returns, and we said, well, we're not 7 years old. We're only 2 years old, and this goes on and on. And they said, well, we need all your financial projections. We need everything else for months. And we were like, we don't give that to anybody. Like that's just to our investors. Meanwhile, the people who are working for us, they are just crying for space. So I eventually send them the stuff, and we had just completed a funding round. So we had $10 million in the bank. The rent on this place, by the way, was like $3,000 a month. And they said, oh, we wanted 3 years in advance, or 2 years up front or something. We're like, we don't do that. So we finally get, and they look at this. I thought, oh, the 10 million in the bank, they're just going to go, oh, okay. And they said, well, no, we look at your projections and you're going to run out of money in like a year. And I said, oh, no, we're going to blow through that money far faster than a year, because we're going to hire like crazy now that we got so we're going to need more money. But don't worry, we're going to raise more. This goes on for months and months and months and months, and we finally get that building. At the same time, we're renting a much more expensive, giant warehouse space in San Carlos here. And once we settled on the price, the entire negotiation after that was literally the landlord said, are you venture backed? And I said, yes. And it says, can we get shares in the company? And I said, no. And they're like, fine. They never asked for anything else. Like the whole thing, it took, and it was a much, much larger financial deal. That kind of friction really makes everything harder. Like if we'd been we never could have gotten that space in Detroit. So it's not just the fact you have a university and you have some VC money. It's that the entire ecosystem, from the lawyers to the real estate agents to the landlords, all have to be in on the game. They all have to believe. So it takes a while to establish that culture. And so you can't just replicate it. It's not a government policy where they just say, oh, we're going to create, Silicon Swamp or Silicon Forest or whatever. It really is this ecosystem. And it's, obviously, yes, it can be replicated, and it is being replicated, but it's not something you can turn on really quickly. A long answer, but it's a big issue.
I think it's something that I would definitely think about after our conversation, because you've uncovered a very different side from what is usually discussed. And you would think about universities, you would think about venture capitalists and the money that are available there, and you would think about the ideas that are also present in the Silicon Valley. You think there is a lot of ideas, but then what you've said, there is another side of it, like the foundation of everything that makes it happen, and you cannot really switch it on and off.
It's a cultural shift. Once it happens, I think it can hopefully be self-sustaining for a while.
Let's talk about international business, my area of study, my area of research, and something that I teach. I know that you've been writing about globalization. I've read a couple of your posts. What are the key globalization lessons that you would like international business students to think about?
Well, so I'm a globalist. I mean, I've always believed, and I grew up at a time when the world was becoming much more open. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and trade barriers were falling all over the place. And I still believe that that's the most efficient, the best way, the best way for a whole lot of reasons, not only the pure economic reasons of differential productivity and stuff, but also the cultural exchange, the idea exchange, which I think is super, super crucial. Clearly, though, there are winners and losers in that. And different governments, particularly in the US, we've done a terrible job of helping the people who lose out because not everyone wins, when we globalize. I also think that the pandemic and then before that certain supply and trade disputes between countries does show that sometimes we have extended our supply chains out a little too far. However, if you think about a modern chip, whether it's Apple's new, M1 chip or, an Intel Pentium class processor, it sits on such a very, very tall pyramid of technology and of suppliers. And, the latest fabs can only be the pieces that go into that silicon fab. Those pieces are only possible in a couple of places on Earth. The lasers have to come from, Switzerland or whatever, because that's the only place on Earth that can make that kind of laser. And there isn't really a market for 10 of those. Like there's really, the market is really, really small. So you can only have one or two companies, in that world. And it just so happens that I think it's Switzerland or Austria or somewhere in Europe. And there's all these pieces of the puzzle that draw from all over the world. The pandemic and the vaccines. I mean, these especially the messenger RNA vaccines are super impressive. It opens up a whole new idea of how to do this kind of vaccinations and medicine, and it wasn't possible unless there was all this commerce, all of these ideas flowing, from the U.S. and Europe that made that possible. From all really from like 10 countries were involved. If you look at the supply chain for that to make those two vaccines. So it's super important that we maintain those trade and intellectual connections. I do suspect that there are certain things, one can argue a country probably doesn't want to be utterly dependent on another country for water, or food, or, there's probably some things that actually, it's reasonable for national security reasons to have, and national resilience reasons, I want to say, is a better term, to have sort of localized supply chains. But I'm a globalist, so I think ultimately the world economy that we want to see is much more open. Obviously governments can distort that in nefarious ways, and we do have to. I mean, that's in theory what the WTO is for, but.
Do you think that COVID-19 has changed the way multinational companies decide on the location for their investments?
I don't know about multinational corporations. It certainly has changed the way that even like VCs in Silicon Valley operate. So I'm not sure that we will ever take another first meeting with the company in person. I mean, I may be wrong on that, but I don't think we'll do that again. Once we went virtual, we saw a much wider geographic range of companies presenting at first for that first meeting. And that was really eye-opening. It was like super exciting. And we actually have made a couple of investments in companies that aren't just, there's an old joke that people in Silicon Valley didn't want to invest more than about a 30-minute drive because they didn't want to have to go any further than a board, for a board meeting. There's some truth to that. I mean, it isn't really, but there is some truth to that. And the pandemic has certainly made it so we're much more open to companies that are a little further away. We've always been, we've invested in all kinds of companies, and even outside of the U.S. But those are companies that have their act together enough, basically, to come to Silicon Valley and have the resources to come to Silicon Valley and have the intros and everything else. It's been pretty exciting to see that you don't have to have that you can actually just do and you're at a level playing field, because that company in Palo Alto and that company in, Des Moines look the same on Zoom, and that's, so I think that's an example where the investment flows will be changing a little bit. Certainly the employment flows will. So many of our companies now have remote workers that, including Spero Ventures, and it's unclear whether we'll ever be in the same physical space in the same way again.
I think that now I would like to ask a question about my hobby. I know that you're a software person, and I like to explore new things. And recently, I've uncovered Arduino for myself. I managed to make a device and to also code it, so it actually works. With Arduino, and for people like me who have no experience in coding, Arduino helps to reconcile the abstract ideas of coding with the physical device that you can actually see and you can see how it works. So I'm curious if you have tried it yourself, and what thoughts do you have about open source software?
Oh, so yeah, I have a whole bunch of Arduinos around. Um, I really like open source. I use it, all the time because as a programmer, I still, do programming, as a hobby, sort of weirdly, but it's true. And I always at first look to see, is there an open source project that approximates what I'm trying to do? And many times, I'll go over to GitHub and I'll find the thing and I'll download it. And even if I choose not to use it entirely, it will it's a great launch pad for me. The projects that I do tend to be things that are something I want, but I do it in a way that uh, it will teach me something. So, uh, and I have some strange ones. So everything from I've used Arduinos for soapbox derby timers, which are these. So you have these cars that are just gravity. Kids make them. They make them of wood, and they have this sort of kit of wheels, and they roll down a hill. And our local community did that. So I provided all the timing for that, and I did that with a couple of Arduinos and little lasers on both sides and stuff. And what I wanted to do there is I wanted to explore certain wireless technologies. So I, got some Arduinos and I got some little tiny transceivers, and played with that. It was a great excuse for me to play with this technology. Um, I will admit, I have moved on from Arduinos though. I'm actually much more into Raspberry Pis, which actually come out of the UK. And actually, one of my friends is on the board of Raspberry. And the reason why I sort of graduated up is I am a total, even though I'm a firmware person by trade, I happen to love Python, and and Python needs a little bit more compute power. I also have gotten into machine learning and sort of machine vision. So you need to have a little bit more compute, and the new Raspberry Pis will do that. And so when you mentioned this, I just happen to have a project which I can't really demonstrate, but um, so this is an animatronic. It doesn't have its wings on. It's an animatronic raven. Okay. And this is a kit that a friend of mine gave me for Christmas a couple of years ago. But what I've done is, and there's little servos that make the wings flap and the beak go up and down and the head turn and it sort of stands up and goes down. And then there's here's a Raspberry Pi, which and I put a servo controller on it. And then there's a camera that plugs in. It has to be mounted here. And ultimately I'll mount the camera probably in the base, looking at it. It'll pretend like the raven can see, but it'll actually where the camera element will be down in the base. And what I want it to do is, and I actually have this. I just knocked it over. I have this working to some degree. Is when somebody comes into the frame, it wakes up. So it's sitting there. It's just a bird. It kind of fidgets every once in a while, and then when an object comes into the frame, it does face recognition. Not individual, but I mean, I could, but I'm really, when a human walks in, it then sort of wakes up and can talk, and it'll look at the person. And if multiple faces are in the frame, it'll look at one, it'll look at the closest one, the biggest one is what I'm doing. And then it'll occasionally glance over at the younger one. I have I have a set of eyeballs too that I did with Arduinos. Um, that's a very similar sort of thing, and I'll show you that these are little eyeballs that I 3D printed, and they're all servo controlled, and you can see the little servos. Yeah, so I do stuff like that all the time. Uh, I haven't had time to work on them recently though, so they're kind of stalled projects. But
I think it's amazing. It's fascinating. I think what it helps is it helps to shift your mind from stress, from other things, and you just do something that is unconnected to everything else. And then
exactly.
you have an amazing project. And you also have, you can do two things at the same time. You do something on the computer, but also you have to work physically with a device. And
Hmm.
this sort
Yeah,
of,
which is why the wings are not on this, is because when I built the wings, they didn't come out nearly as well as I wanted. So I never mounted them. I have to redo the wings. All those feathers, it was a pain.
I'm sure that it will be done and it will be beautiful. It would be, I would be very curious to know how it will look like when it's done. My final question that I now ask all my guests, can you please offer a word of advice to our students?
Hmm. Well, um, yeah, I have a couple of things, I guess. So, uh, so Reid Hoffman has a great podcast called Masters of Scale. And Reid Hoffman is the founder of LinkedIn, among other things, and he's a venture capitalist. He talks about um, your hero's journey. You all want everyone kind of wants to be the hero in their own story, and when you join a company, especially coming out of school, or when you join a company, think about where you are on that journey and what you want to get out of the company, which it's not. And I say get out of the company, what you want to get out of that journey, of that experience working for that company, and which doesn't mean, oh, I want to have this, I want to become the director of this, and I want to. It's much more. It's like, oh, I need to be able to understand how to manage teams of people, or I need to be able to really understand how corporate finance works in the real world, or whatever it is that your particular thing is. So when you go into a company, or when you get into that position, you sort of know what you're looking for, and it might not be, you know, uh, a promotion in that. It might have nothing to do with a promotion. It might have to do with, I want international experience. So I want to make sure that I'm willing to not get that promotion because I want to go work in Brazil for a while, or whatever, to just have a very clear vision of that. I wish that I had been more deliberate in my learnings coming out of college. I had a great time. I worked all over the world. I did all kinds of fun things. I could have optimized that a lot more if I had thought about this in advance. So that's one thing I would urge people to do.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your time. It was an amazing conversation. Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. It's been great fun.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.